In 1819, the famed British monarch Queen Victoria was born. Her life has been extremely well documented, but less well known is her mother's life. You may think that being mother of a queen meant an easy life, but for a time Queen Victoria despised her mother and the royal family even more. So, why was she so hated? To find out, let's go back to the beginning. Marie-Louise Victoria was born on the 17th of August 1786 in the town of Coburg in Upper Franconia on the northern edges of the Bavaria region of southern Germany. Her father was Franz Frederick Anton, Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. The Duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld was one of the Saxon duchies which were located in southern and western Saxony and parts of northern Bavaria. They were ruled by various members of the wider Ernestine line of the House of Wettin. These had only been small German powers in the 17th century, but through a series of favourable marriages, the House of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld was rising to become a greater player on the European stage. Victoria's mother was a Countess Augusta of Reuss-Ebersdorf, who came from a middling German aristocratic family. She and Franz would have 10 children, several of whom attained prominent positions within Europe, notably their son Leopold, who in 1831 would become the first King of Belgium following the country's independence in 1830. Victoria's youth was both eventful on the international scene, yet somewhat personally uneventful. The times she was living through were some of the most significant in the history of Europe, and before she turned 3 years old, the French Revolution broke out to the west. Because of this, her early years were spent in the shadow of constant wars, as France defended itself from British and Austrian aggression, and then became the aggressor itself in the French Revolutionary Wars. By the time Victoria was old enough to understand what was occurring, Germany was being pulled into these conflicts. Yet, as a daughter of a prominent aristocratic family, her life was hardly affected by the everyday food shortages and political instability across the continent. Instead, she was educated at home and prepared for a political marriage. But how these marriages came about might surprise you. Victoria was married to Emil Karl, Prince of Leiningen, on the 21st of December 1803 at Coburg. Emil Karl was the heir to the lands of the Counts of Leiningen-Dasburg-Hartenberg, which lay in what was then the western extremities of Germany, but much of which is now part of eastern France. Victoria was just gone 17. Her new husband, however, was 40, and she was his second wife. Moreover, his deceased first wife was Victoria's aunt, Countess Henrietta of Reuss-Ebersdorf. As you probably know, marriage to close family members was not too uncommon in Europe at the time, and the aristocracy would frequently marry their in-laws or cousins. Victoria's first marriage lasted 11 years, until the prince died in the summer of 1814. It resulted in 2 children, a boy named Charles or Karl after his father, who Victoria gave birth to in September 1804, and a daughter named Theodora, born in December 1807. Both of these children would go on to play a relatively important role in German politics and dynastic arrangements, but they are overshadowed by Victoria's much more famous third child. Following her husband's death in 1814, Victoria became regent for her son Karl as Prince of Leiningen. He was just 9 years of age when his father died, and would rule as a minor for many years to come. However, her role as regent for her son would be interrupted before he attained his majority. This was owing to events in Britain. In November 1817, Victoria's sister-in-law Princess Charlotte of Britain, who had only recently married Victoria's brother Leopold, died owing to complications from childbirth. This created a huge problem in Britain, a succession crisis. King George III and his wife Queen Charlotte had 15 children, but no legitimate grandchildren other than Charlotte had been born to secure the royal line. Owing to this, many of the king's sons raced to marry, breed, and secure the line. One of these was Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. Negotiations were quickly entered into, and he and Victoria were married in the summer of 1818. Edward was slightly younger than her first husband. Nevertheless, he was still 19 years older than her. Following their nuptials, Victoria, who was now Duchess Victoria of Kent, went with Edward to Germany, where they briefly lived. Yet, when she fell pregnant just a few months later, they decided to head for Britain, the country where their child might just rule one day, if they were lucky. It was there at Kensington Palace in London that the Duchess gave birth to a daughter on the 24th of May 1819. They named her Alexandrina Victoria. They cannot have known it at the time, but her name would become synonymous with the history of Britain at the height of its empire. Sadly, the young Princess Victoria would only be raised by one of her parents. On the 23rd of January 1820, just 8 months after Victoria was born, Edward died of pneumonia. Just 6 days later, the old King George III, who had reigned for over 60 years, died too. He was succeeded by his eldest son, George, but George IV was nearly 60, as were his brothers. This made the possibility of the now baby Princess Victoria succeeding to the throne at a young age all the more likely, but as she grew up, a bitter feud would emerge. From her earliest days, the Duchess was determined to keep a close eye over her daughter. For instance, as an infant she nursed her herself, rather than employing a wet nurse, as was the standard practice amongst royalty at the time. She was also distrustful of both the British Parliament and the wider royal family, both of which she believed would attempt to intervene in how she raised her daughter, given that she was in line to succeed to the throne one day. For their part, Parliament and the royal family did little to lessen her doubts. They provided her with a comparatively modest sum of money, and they were forced to reside in the apartments in Kensington Palace, which were quite run down in the early 19th century. Parliament's unwillingness to provide greater financial support was owing to the recklessness of her brothers-in-law, many of whom had accrued large gambling debts over the years and had to be bailed out by the government time and time again. However, the greater problem as the years went by was a bitter division within the management of her household itself. This emerged as a result of a battle for control of affairs between Baroness Liesen, Princess Victoria's much-loved German governess, and Sir John Ponsonby Conroy, the controller and private secretary of the Duchess. At the heart of this were Conroy's ambitions to become a powerful figure at the young princess's future court when she became queen. In order to facilitate this, he preyed on the Duchess's insecurities, claiming that the royal family would effectively try to kidnap her daughter if she were not closely watched over. The result of all of this was a plan called the Kensington system. The system involved a strict and elaborate set of rules designed to make the princess dependent on the pair when her time as queen came. For example, the Duchess was extremely protective of her daughter and ever wary of the wider royal family. She very rarely allowed her daughter to meet her relatives, instead keeping her cocooned and isolated at Kensington Palace. Conroy's persuasion and suggestions allowed him to inveigle his way into the Duchess's good graces, but the young princess hated him. Conroy was known to have bullied and insulted young Victoria, and along with her mother monitored her every move, making sure she never slept alone, never played with other girls, and always held someone's hand when walking up and down stairs. In fact, the princess would sleep in the same room as her mother until she turned 18. She would later claim that her only close friends growing up were her half-sister Theodora, who had left England in 1828 when she was still a child, and Conroy's daughters, Victoire and Elizabeth. So, would this plan and the controlling nature over the princess work? The answer is no. By the 1830s, the Kensington system had produced a negative reaction, and as we will see, it led to the pair being heavily disliked. Court gossip mongers and even senior politicians, such as the Prime Minister for much of the 1830s, Lord Melbourne, were concerned that Conroy and the Duchess were lovers, and that he planned on marrying the mother of the future Queen. This had all taken on a greater significance by the 1830s, as the princess was ever closer to ascending to the throne. In 1830, her uncle, King George IV, died. He was succeeded by his brother, William, who became King William IV. However, he too had no heir, and with George III's other living sons having been younger than Victoria's father Edward, her claim to the throne came before theirs. Therefore, it was increasingly likely that Victoria would succeed her uncle, and sooner rather than later. The position of Victoria as next in line to William created further difficulties in the 1830s, owing to a decision by the Duchess and Conroy to take her on a series of royal tours, the idea being to give the nation a greater sight of the woman who would rule them one day. Measures like this created resentment in King William, but there was little he could do about it. In response to the whole situation, the king gave a speech at his birthday banquet in August 1836, with the Duchess and Princess Victoria present, stating the following: "I trust to God that my life may be spared for 9 months longer. I should then have the satisfaction of leaving the exercise of the royal authority to the personal authority of that young lady, heiress presumptive to the crown, and not in the hands of a person now near me, who is surrounded by evil advisers, and is herself incompetent to act with the propriety in the situation in which she would be placed." As Victoria's 18th birthday drew closer, the situation became unbearable, and Victoria was no longer on speaking terms with her mother. Then, on the 20th of June 1837, King William died, just weeks after Victoria's 18th birthday. William no doubt died somewhat easier, knowing he had lived long enough to foil his sister-in-law's ambitions. The new Queen Victoria would rule Britain for the next 63 years. Victoria's accession as Queen caused irreparable damage to her and her mother's relationship. Her mother had been overly protective and had isolated her throughout her entire childhood and teenage years. It is a striking fact that the Duchess only saw her daughter move out of her own bedroom when she became Queen and headed for Windsor Castle. The feud continued to worsen after Victoria refused to make Conroy her private secretary. The Duchess had continued to support Conroy's schemes, and as a result Queen Victoria grew distrustful towards her mother and detested Conroy and his system, and her mother's willingness to go along with it permanently. A further sign of frostiness between the Queen and her mother was evident at her coronation on the 28th of June 1838, a year after her accession. At this, the young Victoria kissed her aunt, Queen Adelaide, the widow of King William IV, but notably only shook her mother's hand, in a public show of the rift between mother and daughter. Things only improved following Queen Victoria's marriage to her mother's nephew, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg, on the 10th of February 1840. The marriage provided a useful opportunity for the young Queen to remove the last threads of influence of Sir John Conroy, and with this he had no power over court affairs. With this link severed, and with Prince Albert's help, relations between the pair improved from 1840 onwards. The Duchess's last years were spent relatively harmoniously at court, where she happily became a grandmother to Victoria and Albert's many children. She was one of the first to notice that one of the newborn children, Prince Leopold, was suffering from an undiagnosed illness. This would turn out to be haemophilia, which would blight the royal family for decades to come, and which spread amongst Europe's royal lines through the extensive marriages of the Duchess's grandchildren. The Duchess of Kent Victoria died of cancer at Frogmore House at Windsor on the 16th of March 1861. She was briefly interred at St. George's Chapel before being buried at the Royal Mausoleum at Windsor. Her death is known to have caused Queen Victoria great distress, as she read through her mother's personal papers in the weeks that followed, and suddenly realized that for all the peculiar elements of her upbringing, her mother had loved her deeply, and always acted in what she believed was her daughter's best interest. Less than a year later, Victoria's own husband Albert died. Thereafter, the Queen became excessively attached to her youngest child Beatrice, whom she brought up to remain in her own household. It was a peculiar case of a daughter imitating mother. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, or the Duchess of Kent. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the video down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also be sure to leave them in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and the notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. And anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.